Hello and welcome to myfinanceteacher.org. Today I'm going to present you our May Uranium Report, where we're going to start with some fundamentals, something very interesting happening in the nuclear industry lately. Then we're going to move to long-term contracting, what's been happening there, and some of the price changes that might be interesting to you as well. And we're going to finish off with some of the most interesting developments all throughout the world. So welcome again, and let's start with our fundamentals section. Let's start with this recent survey. Nuclear Energy Institute recently released a survey of nuclear generators or utilities. The results are very bullish, at least in my opinion, for uranium prices and perhaps for prices of those uranium producers. Let's have a look at some of the interesting results here. Over 90% of respondents, and remember these respondents are those utilities, are those nuclear power generators, over 90% of them expect an approval to operate for at least 80 years. That is, most of them would operate until 2050 and beyond, to infinity and beyond. Nearly 2/3 of respondents indicated their interest in new nuclear technology, such as light water SMRs and non-light water advanced reactors. Nearly half of the respondents were interested in a new reactor, that's investing in a new reactor. And some are as early as next year application for those reactors. So all of these align pretty well with plans for over $6 billion of capital investments, of capex, by these nuclear generators. Very, very bullish developments. Looking at the chart in front of you, that's on the right side of your screen, we see that compared to the previous decade, from 2013 to 2022 to last year, and going into the next decade up to 2032, the respondents expect a 60% increase in license applications, so there will be more nuclear generators. And in terms of the total capacity, it's expected to increase by 90%. Next, moving on to the recent World Nuclear Fuel Cycle Conference in Netherlands, where the president and CEO of Nuclear Energy Institute, Maria Korsnick, said the following: "We've never been in a time like this. We've gone from can we build it to can we build it fast enough. Nuclear is receiving unprecedented levels of bipartisan support at the national level, while more than 200 bills to support or advance nuclear energy are currently before state legislatures. Nuclear energy is the puzzle piece that makes it all work. Compared to what we've seen before, that's a change from night to day." And at the same conference, Jonathan Hinz, that's a principal from UXC, those are prominent uranium consultants, he presented the case that the shift away from Russia could result in about 33 to 34 million additional pounds in uranium demand. So all that demand shifting from the east to the west might be quite beneficial to such instruments as URNM, let's say. And together with the members at myfinanceteacher.org, we do hold URNM as well as other uranium-related instruments, so join us for more details. Moving on to a recent podcast from Sprott, there was a discussion between Per Jander, he's from WMC Energy, and Trevor Klingbeil, she's from Trade Tech. Those are also uranium consultants. Some of the interesting things she mentioned were about government support, not only in China or in the US, but she mentioned there is government support globally. Some examples within US she mentioned are the Inflation Reduction Act and the Nuclear Fuel Credit Program. With those programs now, utilities, the power generators, nuclear power generators in the US have the comfort that they can buy fuel without worrying that their plants, their generators, will be shut down within 3 years. So being more confident to buy more uranium, again, doesn't it sound bullish? I think it does. They also discussed SMRs, saying that they will move along in the development. We see a GE, Hitachi, NuScale and Rolls-Royce and a lot of other players as well have really excellent programs on building some of those SMRs. We've seen more details of such examples in some of the previous uranium reports. I mentioned Rolls-Royce planning to build several SMRs in the UK, for example. By the way, at myfinanceteacher.org, we do have these uranium reports monthly. So coming back to these SMRs, While they are still in development, by 2035 they'll be contributing to at least to over 200 million pounds of additional demand. Again, very, very bullish. Next, let's have a look at a couple of interesting charts over here. The one on the left is the global uranium demand. That's the black line over here. As you see, the demand is going to grow from around 160 million pounds right now to over 200 million pounds in the next 10 years. That's up to 2033. This chart also shows uncovered uranium requirements for the US, that's the gray value over here, and non-US, the rest of the world, blue area over here. We see that going into the future, even just over the next 3 to 4 years, these uncovered quantities, that's basically the quantities that the utilities, the power generators, will still have to purchase, usually through a long-term contracts. Those are growing really fast going into the next just even several years. So with all of the growing demand for power SMRs being built and developed, it's clear that the utilities will soon have to accelerate their long-term purchasing programs. Again, that might be quite bullish. Looking at the chart on the right, that's from EIA, so that relates more to the US rather than a global picture over here. On the left we see millions, that's hundreds of millions of pounds of demand. On the right we see tens of thousands of demand, that's from the US nuclear power generators. And the interesting part of this chart is again the blue area. I think that's unfilled market requirements. Again, those are the quantities that the power generators will still have to purchase. And comparing 2023 to even just 2024 or 2025, these quantities multiply pretty fast. Next year looks like it's at least double the amount of this year. And 2025 is at least triple the unfilled quantities of this year. Yes, utilities might still have some inventories, but those are going to dwindle really fast with this blue area expanding nearly exponentially. So I do like both of these charts. Now we have finished the section on fundamentals. Next, let's move on to some discussion of long-term contracting by the utilities. And we're going to have a look at interesting price charts. We're going to leave the technicals for another video, but I do think that you'll find the price chart quite interesting. So starting with this chart, this is mainly the chart of the uranium purchases by nuclear generators. The dark columns over here, that's purchases through the long-term contracts. The lighter blue columns over here are the purchases on the spot market. So the encouraging piece on this chart is all the way since the Fukushima disaster. Last year, 2022, was the first year in a decade when these uranium purchases exceeded 100 million pounds. So perhaps we are entering in a new bull market in uranium, something like we've seen all through 2024, 2025, 2026. Wouldn't that be amazing? And looking at the 2023 so far, just in the first 4 months between January and April, there were nearly 17 million pounds of uranium already purchased through the spot markets and over 88 million pounds already purchased in the first 4 months through the long-term contracts. Next, talking about those prices, consider the conversion and enrichment prices. Those are the blue and red respectively. Basically, once you get uranium out of the ground, you need to first convert it from a U308 into a UF6. Then you need to enrich it so that there is enough isotopes within the useful material. The prices of these conversion and enrichment services, as you see, have tripled, at least doubled and tripled, just since the beginning of last year. While the uranium price, that's the green line over here, has been lagging all through the beginning of last year again. So there is demand. That's why the prices downstream in the demand pipeline, that's around conversion and enrichment downstream, have skyrocketed, while upstream, the uranium itself, hasn't really caught up yet. But as demand pushes forwards upstream, I'm sure that sometime in future, uranium prices will have to catch up. And looking at the price change from last month, That's basically a change from $50 to around $53 or $54 in April. Perhaps the catch-up is about to start. We'll have to see. On the right side, you see uranium purchases by a couple of well-known trusts holding the uranium. SPUT, that's a Sprott Physical Uranium Trust, and Yellow Cake. All throughout last year, or rather closer to the beginning of last year, Sprott actually contributed pretty well to this rise in uranium prices. A little later, into the end of last year, the purchases from Sprott were slowing down a little bit, picking up a bit in January and February, and they're down to 100,000 pounds again in March and April. Next, having finished with our section on long-term contracts and those service prices, let's move on to some of the most interesting developments all throughout the world. And I'm going to start with North America. In Canada, Cameco recently mentioned that due to steadily improving market conditions, they are considering to increase production from McArthur River up to its licensed capacity of 25 million pounds per year. You might interpret this news in both ways, positively and perhaps a little bit negatively. The negative part might be due to increasing uranium supply, perhaps slowing down any future price growth. But on the other hand, this increased supply is due to rising demand, due to constantly improving market conditions. And even if there is sort of any negligible slowdown in the future rise of uranium price due to this additional supply, it is still a bullish news specifically for Cameco, that's a CCJ on the market. Moving on down from Canada to the US, the Biden administration is offering $1.2 billion to extend life of distressed nuclear power generators, which in turn, in future, are most likely to contribute to additional uranium demand. Talking about this possible future demand, Bank of America recently published one of their new articles, The Nuclear Necessity, the Third Bull Market for Uranium, where they say that after a decade of underinvestment, a shortage is visible. Their strategies forecast 20 to 40% upside in uranium prices. I think there's a pretty good chance for a more significant rally, especially in the longer term. Back to Bank of America, global demand is also rising, they say, with 60 new reactors being built and 100 more already approved. Next, we're going to move on to Western Europe, starting from Belgium, where a recent poll shows that 5 times more Belgians approve of nuclear power plant life extensions than those who oppose it. Over the last few years, Belgian government has been reducing their nuclear power generation. So perhaps, hopefully, this recent poll is going to turn around that trend. Moving on to the UK, which recently signed an agreement with South Korea, declaring the intent for energy transition from fossil fuels to low carbon power sources. The objective of the agreement is advancing civil nuclear power generation, cementing a partnership covering issues including safety standards and regulations in creating secure, affordable and clean energy. And yes, nuclear can give you all of that. Moving on to Netherlands, the Dutch government is preparing a very interesting budget over here, funding about $350 million for development of nuclear energy. Again, very, very bullish. Have already said that. Next, moving on to Eastern Europe, let's start from Poland, where the US-based Export-Import Bank is going to lend $3 billion. That's not all. The US International Development Finance Corporation is going to add another $1 billion, and the aim of all of that is to develop 20 SMRs with, again, a familiar goal of creating cheap, clean and reliable energy source. Next, moving on to Finland, they've just recently started up their new reactor, that's Olkiluoto 3, with its 1,600 megawatt capacity. For Finland, around 40% of its electricity comes from nuclear. Next, moving on to Bulgaria, up to recently it had been buying its uranium from Russia, but it has signed a new agreement with Cameco to meet full requirements at its Kozloduy 5 reactor. And over the next 10 years, up to 2033, Cameco will deliver around 5.7 million pounds of uranium to Bulgaria, where nuclear accounts for about 1/3 of electricity generation. Next, let's move on to Central Asia, talking about Kazakhstan. We have Kazatomprom here, one of the largest, if not the largest uranium producer in the world. And over the last year and the last few months, they still have been having some problems catching up with their expected production. So the situation is a little opposite to Cameco. You might consider this difficulty as an additional supply constraint, perhaps helping the price to stay elevated a little bit. And on a more interesting note as it relates to Kazakhstan and China, just yesterday at their shareholders meeting, Kazatomprom announced, or they have basically come to the agreement with over a 90% vote in support of a significantly large sale of uranium to China. The sale is so large, in fact, that it did require an approval at the general shareholder meeting. So something really significant is happening there. Countries, especially China, are already scrambling to buy and perhaps hoard a lot of uranium. In some of my previous reports, I did mention about the new uranium hub, or a sort of uranium strategic reserve, that China is building not far from its border with Kazakhstan. And the amounts there are quite significant, as large as the total annual production by this largest producer in the world. So as China buys uranium to fill up that strategic reserves, how do you think it's going to affect uranium prices globally? Next, moving on to Africa, Namibia. Although I do have Japan over here, we're going to talk about Japan in a second. Last year, in 2022, Namibia produced 2.6% less uranium compared to the previous year in 2021. Let me point out that Namibia is actually third largest uranium producer in the world as a country after Kazakhstan and Canada. Moving on to Japan, at the end of April, the lower house of Japanese parliament approved the plan to extend the operation of nuclear power generators over 60 years. But the process isn't complete yet. This has to still be approved by the upper house of the parliament. And lastly, let's move to China, which stands head and shoulders above all other countries in terms of upcoming pipeline of new nuclear capacity. This chart shows that the new capacity, if you include those under construction, announced, permitted and financed, all of these in China are basically above the upcoming capacities in the rest of the world. So while uranium prices have been kind of depressed over the last many months, huge increase in demand is coming in the longer term. We've been discussing that in many of our uranium reports. So to stay up to date with this once in at least 20-year opportunity, look at this chart. The last time uranium purchases skyrocketed was around 20 years ago. So again, to stay up to date with this once in a 20-year opportunity, make sure you follow us on YouTube and consider joining us at myfinancesteacher.org. Have a wonderful weekend. Bye bye.